Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Cleveland Clinic CEO and President, Dr. Tom Mihaljevic.
Good evening and welcome. The Cleveland Orchestra is a cultural treasure. It is widely considered one of the best orchestras in the world, and here in Cleveland we all know it is the best orchestra in the world. Yeah. And much of the credit for such recognition goes to its current music director, Franz Welser-Möst. Since 2002, Franz has raised the orchestra's sound to new levels of excellence. He has expanded a repertoire, built an audience, and continues to elevate already an exceptional reputation of Cleveland as a world capital of classical music. Franz was, at the age of 30, named as the music director of the London Philharmonic Orchestra. He went on to build a towering reputation as an opera conductor, leading the Vienna State Opera and Zurich Opera. Today, he's the 7th music director in a 101-year-long history of the Cleveland Orchestra. In this role, he guides the orchestra's musical identity. He shapes its sounds, interprets its repertoire, and it's visionary of its programming. Critics all over the world praise our orchestra, and we call it ours because all of the Clevelanders identify with the Cleveland Orchestra. And under Franz's musical direction, the orchestra has refreshed its standard repertoire for a new generation. It has also commissioned more than 20 new works from contemporary composers and revived an annual opera performances that so many of us enjoy. This year, Franz led the orchestra on a triumphant tour of Asia, performing 11 concerts in 7 cities in 3 weeks. The China Times described their sound as impeccable. Franz and his wife Gaili have homes here in Cleveland and in Austria, and I believe in Zurich as well. No? Okay, well, not in Zurich. In his spare time, Franz enjoys reading, hiking, and yoga, but here's also a video to tell you more.
Using a universal language, he fills concert halls and opera houses with exquisite sound. For nearly 2 decades, Franz WelserMst has directed the world-renowned Cleveland Orchestra. He's one of today's most distinguished conductors, captivating and inspiring audiences around the world. Born in Linz, Austria, as a youth, Franz WelserMst studied violin and later developed a passion for conducting. He picked up the baton for his first major debut at the Salzburg Festival in 1985, and then made his American conducting debut with the St. Louis Symphony 4 years later. In 1993, WelserMst first collaborated with the Cleveland Orchestra as a guest conductor at Severance Hall. 9 years later, he became the orchestra's 7th music director, elevating the ensemble to be declared America's Best Orchestra by the New York Times. With a commitment to reaching more people with music, Franz WelserMst and the Cleveland Orchestra have successfully built the youngest audience for classical music in the United States through groundbreaking programs involving families, students, and community partnerships. He brings an innovative approach to orchestral programming, introducing new music and reinvigorating unknown works. Franz WelserMst and the Cleveland Orchestra are frequent guests at many prestigious concert halls and festivals around the world, including regular appearances in Vienna, New York, and Miami, as well as at the Salzburg and Lucerne festivals. Also under his direction, Franz WelserMst's audio and video recordings have won major recognition, including a Gramophone Award, 2 Grammy nominations, and the Echo Classic Award for Best Opera Recording. From the first downbeat to the cutoff, Franz WelserMst explores and reveals the essence of a piece. He inspires musicians to transport audiences with emotional intensity, reaching for meaning in every note. He expands the musical boundaries for audiences of all ages.
Please join me in welcoming Franz WelserMst. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Franz, welcome to Cleveland Clinic.
Thank you very much.
I
was here last fall for another purpose. But I'm glad I'm back this way.
Okay. I would certainly hope so. As you and I had a few conversations, I learned that the medical environment is not foreign to you. You actually grew up in a family of physicians.
That's right. My father was a physician. My grandfather was one. Two of my siblings are. And I still like doctors.
So could you tell us a little bit more, just going back in the past, how has your family environment shaped your affinity to music and made you a person that you are today?
You know, in those days, I'm born in 1960, and in those days it was just normal upbringing for an Austrian child to learn an instrument. All my 4 siblings have learned an instrument, so did I. My mother was a passionate amateur pianist, and so classical music was just normal for us. And I have been a little different than my siblings because my elder brothers, they would listen to the Beatles in the 60s. I would listen as a child to Bruckner, which was a little insane. And you know, those were the days. I remember that an acquaintance of my mother, she would lend me a recording of Bruckner's Second Symphony, and I was about 10 years old, and I was so fascinated by that. So every day I would come home from school, put that recording on full power, and after 3 weeks, my mother said, "We know the piece." That's it. But it was somehow, what I'm trying to say is that there was the upbringing, but I was just sort of born with that.
Yeah. And from having a strong affinity to classical music from early on, you were born with a gift, then shift towards from instrument playing to conducting. That had happened also relatively early.
Yes. You know, I was, as a child, I was sort of a very dreamy child. I would live mainly with my books. I love reading, and I have a huge library at home. And I would come home from school, and other than, you know, those were the days we didn't have a television, and you know, recordings were expensive. But other than listening to music or practicing myself, which actually at that time, between the age of 6 and 10, I didn't enjoy playing the violin. But reading was something. I was sort of a very dreamy child, and in the Austrian school system, you have to make a decision, or the parents have to make a decision at the age of 14, which direction and which school you would go. Yeah. And in 1974, there was in Linz a new school opened, and it was with a college, basically, with an emphasis on music. And my parents thought, you know, he's a little goofy. Maybe that's the right thing for him to go to that school. And I remember so well the first day. It was in September '74, and the first day in that school, I knew that's my life. That's what I want to do. And we had a little school orchestra, and I was leading the second violins, and my teacher there, he thought by how I led the second violins, I would have a talent for conducting. And so when I was 16, he one day said to me, "You take over the rehearsal tomorrow." So I was like, I don't know how to do this, and I stood in front of my colleagues and waved my arms, and to my surprise, they actually played. And I started to enjoy that more and more, and after about a year or so, I asked him, my teacher, if I could not only do rehearsals for him, but also could conduct a concert. And he said, yeah, if you organize everything yourself. Which actually made the point that in a job as music director, as a former assistant of mine put it last year when he came back to a concert, he said, the one thing you didn't tell me, and he's now music director with a smaller orchestra in America, and he said, the one thing which you didn't tell me in the 3 years I was here, that music is only 10% of the music director job. And the early days, really, when my teacher said, you know, you have to organize everything yourself. So I was myself the promoter of the concerts. I was the marketing director. I was the stagehand. I was everything. But that's how you actually, I'm grateful for that, because that's how I learned also about the other sides of that job.
Now, let you speak a little bit about the other sides of the job. So those are, so to say, the less visible sides of the job. Everyone sees you in front of the orchestra, but there is an immense amount of effort that you have to put in order to do the piece, but also to choose the people who you're working with, to determine the repertoire. Can you tell us a little bit about what happens behind the stage and before the performance and after the performance that is the part of your job? And I know that this is a loaded and a very broad question.
You know, sometimes I would put it that way. Sometimes you're happy that you go onto stage because nobody can bother you anymore.
Sounds familiar.
But seriously, when you're the artistic leader of such an institution, you have to have a vision for the institution. You have to have a philosophy, and you have to have great people working with you, because you just by yourself, that will not work out. So there goes a lot of planning with members of the board, but mainly with the management team. So where do you want to take the orchestra? What profile should the orchestra have? You know, we live now in 2019. The world has changed. So you have to have a broader view of things. You have to look at the biggest possible picture. That's one of the parts why traveling is teaching you a lot. And you need to work with people who have an open mind. But a lot of time we spend on artistic planning, simply because it's not just putting together a program which is great for the audience to listen to, great in the sense also that it might be emotionally satisfying, but also challenging. You know, there are different angles to look at that. But the entire season has to make sense. And yet, it's like putting together a puzzle, because we are going on tour, so you have to negotiate with the different promoters what program they want, and you have to prepare that, of course, here in Cleveland. Then also, one thing, one day, when I've been music director with different institutions, and one day when I'm not going to be music director anymore, the one thing I'm looking forward to is not to deal with personnel questions. It's, you know, you're working with people.
Yes.
So a very good friend of mine, whose father was a world-famous conductor, and he runs hospitals. He was the CEO for all the Malteser hospitals in Germany with 11,000 employees. And, you know, we go hiking together and we talk a lot about his business, my business, and so on. And as he understands the music business very well because of his father who passed away a couple of years ago, he said to me once, he said, you know, when you talk about your musicians, it's like my doctors, they're all prima donnas. And I said, you know, prima donnas have also good sides.
Yeah, I was just about to say, yes.
No, we're joking about it,
yes.
But there's a serious point in that when we expect the musicians of the Cleveland Orchestra not just to be the best in their business, yeah, but it's then about how you sort of you mold them into the institution and the work ethics and the spirit of that institution. And that's a big, I see that as a big part of my job, yeah, that keeping that spirit and the work ethics alive, because I believe, and I see it with many other institutions in the classical music world, that complacency is the first step to sliding downhill. And it's something which is really special about Cleveland. What was said in the trailer, I didn't bring that to Cleveland. I signed up for it. When I became music director, there always have been enormously high work ethics in this institution. But my job is really to not only maintain them, maybe enhance that. And we are talking sort of about, you know, tiny little improvements. But it's something, if you're in sports, if you want to be LeBron James, you know, you have to put every single day of your career, you have to put the maximum into it. And I have to nurture that. That's the biggest part of my job, really.
So, but the biggest part of the job and your responsibility starts with the selection of the right people for the orchestra. Just before we came up on stage, you told me that on Monday you listened to the auditions the entire day. Could you speak about the qualities that are necessary for you to choose what are you looking into a musician who auditions for the membership of the orchestra, aside from an ability to play an instrument at the level that you think is appropriate?
First of all, what I said backstage to Tommy was listening to bad playing is really exhausting. So auditions are maybe the most exhausting part of my job because you listen to quite a lot of bad playing. But there are three elements, really. One is what you can judge in the audition is if somebody can play the instrument to the level to be expected in the Cleveland Orchestra. The second element is, and 50% of that you can judge in an audition because they play by themselves, is the musicality. music is very much about taking and giving. So to play in an ensemble, that's what we have then the trial period for, which is basically 2 years, where I have to watch and the others, the musicians on stage are watching very carefully how that person interacts musically with everyone else on stage. And the third element is something you only find out through these 2 years, is if the personality is the right fit for this institution. Somebody who might be a very successful, let's say, trumpet player or trombone player or viola player in the New York Philharmonic, the Chicago Symphony, you name it, might not be the right fit for this institution. Because this institution has a different spirit than a lot of other orchestras in this world. So that's something also very important for me to watch, as you see a real dinosaur in front of you, because in the orchestra world, at least in the Western Hemisphere, I'm the last and only music director who has the final say in these personnel questions. That's part of the trade agreement with the players. And it's a huge responsibility, and it has basically costed me a lot of sleepless nights. and by now, over 50% of the orchestra now is actually my choice.
You know, I would like to paraphrase something that you mentioned when we first met. And I assume that very many people always ask you, why are you in Cleveland? Why do you come to Cleveland? You could be anyplace else. And I think you told me, well, I'm in Cleveland because I cannot find Cleveland Orchestra anyplace else.
Yeah, what I meant with that was that spirit, which is really unique. And you come to Cleveland because of the quality you find in your work. It's, you know, it's not only for me to challenge the musicians in rehearsals and performances. Actually, they really challenge the conductor, because when you come into a first rehearsal as a conductor with this group of musicians, and if you would not be well prepared, that's it. You know, yeah. They're an extremely well-behaved group. They will not sort of just scream at you like the New York Film maybe would do. Yeah. But I know they have done it with some conductors. So that's an open secret. But here, I always say, the one thing the Cleveland Orchestra does not know is how to play a bad performance. They just, that is sort of unthinkable for them, whoever stands in front of them, to deliver a bad performance. Sort of, I don't care. It's just not in their DNA.
But even with an exceptional orchestra that you found when you came here 17 years ago, there's always a need for change and a constant evolution in the life cycle of every successful organization. Can you speak a little bit about how to balance the challenge of improving on something that already has an established tradition and established excellence? And then, what are the opportunities that you saw back then within a Cleveland Orchestra, its sound and its culture, that you could contribute and improve upon?
You know, tradition, and I grew up in a lot of tradition, but many people mistake tradition for standstill. And tradition is the trap for complacency. And I can share this with you when, as Dick Bogamone is sitting here, when they went through the process for looking for a new music director, they made a job description, which they showed me after I had been appointed. And they made a list of 100 conductors and sort of went, you know, who has the quality, who would be the right fit, and they had a short list of 3 conductors. And they talked to all 3 of them. And it was Dick Bogamone and Tom Morris, executive director at that time. They came to talk to me. I was one of the 3, obviously. And they said, so what do you think about the Cleveland Orchestra? And I said, you know, it's wonderful, blah, blah, blah. It's a perfectly oiled machine. And then I paused, and they were a little, I could tell they were a little taken aback, and they said, but? And I said, yeah, it's lacking something. And they said, what? And I said, warmth in the sound. And basically, with that one word, there was an artistic vision, or a part of an artistic vision. And when I came down, and when you go into an institution which was sort of very much determined by what they said about George Sell. The saying was, when he came into Severance Hall, even the columns stood straight up. You know, with all due respect to all my predecessors, but you know, when you live in the 21st century, don't pretend to live in the 60s, 50s, whatever. You know, society is changing, and hopefully we actually in this community can actually also be a changer to the better. But you have to have a really good look at yourself. And I didn't share that with anybody when I came, and I only, for the first time I think I talked about was openly about 2 years ago. I was determined to change some of the culture of the institution, because I felt that that's the only way to be successful and not to die. That in a business where in the society, and we have seen that in those 17 years now, dramatically changing how much more competition there is out there via social media, you name it. So, you know, it's every day has to be new, and you have to position yourself without giving up your beliefs. And I have the same firm beliefs I had 17 years ago or 30 years ago, that classical music is really important to our Western culture, and it embeds so many values of Western culture that when people say, you know, classical music is the past, it's dying. No, it's not. I mean, look at, and I grew up with people saying, you know, classical music becomes a museum. Museums are thriving. So, you know, in other words, in great art, there's something, a core, an essence, which never will be outdated, because it's about humanity. And so as once a famous journalist from the New York Times, Jim Ostreich, who is wonderful thinker and a great human being, and it was 5-6 years ago, we had lunch together in New York, and we talked about our business. And you know, in the aftermath of 2008 and the crisis and whatnot, he said, that was his, when we said goodbye, his last line was, "Classical music will not die, the business might die." And that's something which I kept really close to my heart. So referring back to the question what a music director does, these are things which have to be in my thinking as well, that we keep everything alive and forward-looking with taking the great of what we have in classical music, taking that with us and not making it outdated.
So that is something that really intrigues me, is your views on how to integrate a classical music in today's society and tomorrow's society, and the importance of integrating classical music and music education into communities. Can you speak a little bit about your observations from your recent Asia tour? As well as, and then also how those observations change our views on our role here in Cleveland for Cleveland Orchestra.
You know, when we celebrated our centennial, I gave this speech where, okay, we had 100 amazing, great years. What's next? Where should the orchestra be in another 100 years? And it all starts here with this great community. We couldn't do what we did in China without this extraordinary community here. So the first thought has to go into this community. So my vision, based on what these two great ladies 101 years ago, the vision they had, where it all was about music education. My vision was, which I expressed then, was in 100 years down the road, every child in this community should be touched by classical music. It's a vision. It might never turn into 100% reality, but at least you know where you want to go. I was in China in the last 1.5 years 3 times. Once I conducted the Shanghai Opera Orchestra, simply because I thought it would be a nice gesture towards the Chinese audience, that when I, for the first time, come to China, that I would conduct a Chinese orchestra. And then I was there last November with the Vienna Philharmonic, and now for almost 3 weeks in March, April, with the Cleveland Orchestra. First of all, it's the youngest audience you ever will see. 80% of Chinese children learn an instrument. Referring back to complacency, ever so often we rest on our laurels, and I see that a lot when I go and guest conduct in different places. With one famous orchestra, I once said to them, arrogance does not impress me, but it's basically, my prediction is that in one generation, in the big top symphony orchestras, there will be a high percentage of musicians from China and South Korea.
So that will certainly transform the way we look at classical music today.
Classical music is a language you can learn. We just had last week, we had Mitsuko Uchida doing the 100th performance with the Cleveland Orchestra, first time 29 years ago. She's from Japan. And she plays, you know, Schubert like she was born in Vienna. So it's a language you can learn. It's not sort of whatever, or look at, I always love to name that example. Look at Afendi Yusuf, our principal clarinet. He was born in Ethiopia. He came at the age of 11 to Canada with his family. He was put into a school where they said, you know, you should play also in the school band, pick an instrument. He picked the clarinet because he thought it was the easiest. And I asked him, when we hired him, I asked him, you know, any musicians in your family, whatnot? Nothing. He came out of the blue, and this is his first job. But it's just another example that you can learn this language if you're open for it and interested. That's all it is.
You know, it's interesting, speaking about learning a language, and we were drawing parallels between the classical music and the way that it's being played, as well as the art and practice of medicine. And you said something that really, really struck me, is you said that we have to show empathy through the way we play. And it seems to me that the way that you approach classical music is not too dissimilar to the way that we approach the way that we care for patients. It is not just important to deliver a diagnosis to a patient. It is important, just like as your father taught you, it's important to sit down and speak with the patient.
Yeah, he talked about bedside manners. And, but, you know, in our world, we rehearse most of the time without an audience. Sometimes students come or invited guests, whatnot. But a performance, every musician knows that, a performance is something different. Why? Because there's an audience. And we have to, via whatever you want to call it, vibrations, empathy, telepathy, whatever you want to call it, but we actually have to communicate with the audience during a performance. The audience is not just because they're applauding, or like in La Scala, they boo then sometimes. It's not because of that, it's because of the interaction, which happens by some, you can call it magic, whatnot, but it's really the human interaction which makes then a performance great. Yeah. And the audience is an incredibly important part of a performance. Not, as I said, not just because of the applause at the end or coughing something to death, but I tell you, when I go onto stage before we start performing, I know what sort of audience we have in the room. There's, I don't know, it's a sensation, whatever you want to call it, but it's a sort of funny interaction.
You know, it's interesting, we speak about interactions, and oftentimes we'll speak about the effect that the music has on its audience, obviously. What I was really curious to learn from you is an effect that playing in front of the audience in your case conducting in front of the audience, and the effect that it has on music directors, on conductors, and on performers. Can you speak a little bit about the physical and emotional demands that a sustained excellence of playing at a place like a Cleveland Orchestra may have on the members of the orchestra?
First of all, you know, everyone likes success. I put it always into words that I've never met in my entire life a musician who enjoys playing a bad performance. Yeah. They might be, after many years in the job, they might be cynical, whatnot, frustrated, but enjoying a bad performance, I've never met a musician like that. Playing in a top team means you have to be disciplined also outside that. You know, you cannot, in every rehearsal in Severance Hall with this orchestra is already a sort of performance. Everyone wants to shine, wants to do the best. And of course, you know, when you notice there's somebody behind you who plays better than yourself, you know, there's nothing like competition. Yeah. So and you have to be disciplined in so many ways. You know, playing an instrument, let's say the violin, you're in a physical position which is unnatural. So it's over the years really demanding. So you have to make sure if it's yoga or something else or exercising this or that, that you keep in shape. The same, you know, for a trumpet player, the sensitivity a trumpet player has to have in his lips is beyond amazing. So, you know, and it's not just that, it's your entire body which really sort of gets a workout. Yeah. And you know much better than I do, this is really now very amateurish, but I read once that a third of the use of energy comes from the brain. Oh, for sure. And there are medical tests which have been run, and coming now to my profession, that during a performance, we have the same medical outcome of tests like Formula One drivers. I had taken my heart rate during performances because I was interested in it. My pulse in the morning is 50. The peak in a performance is 190. Yeah. So you know,
how bad audition? What's the heart rate of a bad audition?
My pulse is after a while down on 30. I'm barely alive, and I'm in pain. So no, that must have been a musician. But it's something you have to be aware. Yeah. You know, we put so much effort into a performance, and you know, there's this standing joke that audience members ask then musicians or a conductor, what's your main job? What do you do the rest of the day? A lot of it, like especially with these musicians, goes into preparation. And preparation means not just practicing your part, but knowing more about the piece, being physically really on top, so that you can perform at your best.
So I'll just speak briefly about probably the most vulnerable audience that one can possibly imagine. Those are people who are ill. I know that we share the same conviction that arts in general music, classical music in particular, may aid in healing process. We are here in one of the largest, most respected healthcare organizations in the world. And I know that we have done some work together in a number of different areas. If you wouldn't mind just sharing your views and your perspectives of how can the works at the Cleveland Clinic, in this case, and Cleveland Orchestra, complement each other in our joint attempt to bring the empathy to the most vulnerable audience that there is?
You know, I think that there are many ways to go about this, and I'm really happy that you're a classical music lover. He comes like every other week to Severance Hall. And having talked now about the importance of classical music, and I've seen that I've seen it with handicapped people. I've seen it with people struggling, that classical music was what I would call nutrition for their soul. Human beings are not machines. They're human beings. So there's another component than just a physical one. And I, first of all, believe, I mean, we all know that these two institutions, the Cleveland Clinic and the Cleveland Orchestra, share world fame in their areas. And I believe very strongly, and you and I have been talking in March about it, that there are enough areas where we can collaborate. You know, and I said it the other day in the board retreat we had at Severance Hall. I said, and I was talking a little bit or hinting at that the two institutions, you and I want to talk and work together more. And I said it's not just Cleveland Clinic shuffling over to fill some seats in Severance Hall. It's much more. There have been some few attempts in the past where you know, musicians could come over here, but actually also I think what we have to look at is an institution like the Cleveland Clinic, but also like the Cleveland Orchestra. We have a responsibility for this community which goes beyond than the actual work we do.
Correct.
And I mean, you showed that very clearly in all what has happened, just what happened between the first time I came in '93 and what it is now, not just architecturally, but giving more quality of life to this community. And I think these are areas where the two institutions should be talking more.
I couldn't agree more. Let me just ask you, so to say one parting question and then maybe a comment at the end. The person of your stature and a reputation in the organization as important as Cleveland Orchestra, you take a look at your tenure that has been immensely successful and continues to be so. No doubt he has a great future ahead. I'm sure that oftentimes you think about the legacy that you would like to leave with the Cleveland Orchestra. What would that legacy look like?
That's such an American question.
We're in Cleveland, Ohio. It's an important one, though.
You know, I'm sort of a little averse to that because in the end, as a leader, you have to be the best servant for the institution. If you don't know how to serve, you definitely don't know how to lead.
For sure.
So, you know, there's this old Italian saying, the king has to be the first servant to the people, and I totally sign on to that. In my view is, you know, when I'm dead, I'm dead. It's something, what I would hope for is that after my time as music director, that this institution will thrive. And I can sort of plant some seeds for that, but that's it. So, you know, sorry if I put it that way.
No,
if you name a building after me,
yeah.
No, it's, I try to be somebody who lives in the moment now. I enjoy enormously this community. It has become a home for me, and all it is that this institution is a leader in the community, thrives, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Well, Franz, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for leading our community and leading Cleveland Orchestra. We very much enjoyed. Look forward to working closer together. And I have absolutely no illusions that Cleveland Orchestra will continue to thrive under your direction. Thank you so much for being our guest today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
See you out there.
See you again. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I would just like to share with you that we have two upcoming guests for Ideas for Tomorrow. Larry Merlo is the president and CEO of CVS Health, who's coming to visit us here on September the 4th. And then the next one is David Rubenstein. David Rubenstein is, as you know, co-executive chairman and co-founder of the Carlyle Group. You see him in a Bloomberg TV, a phenomenal intellect, phenomenal interviewer and a speaker, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy having him here as an Ideas for Tomorrow guest on November the 25th. Thank you again, and have a nice evening. Thank you.